The January wind had teeth that year, and Cecil Alden found the woman half buried in snow at the edge of his north pasture, like something the storm had swallowed and decided to spit back out. It was 1884, deep in the Wyoming territory, and the cold that had settled over the Powder River Basin. That winter was the kind that did not ask permission before it killed a man. Or a woman, as it turned out. Cecil had ridden out before dawn to check on a section of fence he suspected had gone down in the previous night's blizzard, his big roan gelding, Drummer, picking careful steps through drifts that reached the animal's chest in places. The sky was the pale gray of old ash, and the wind moved across the open land with a low, continuous moan that Cecil had long ago stopped hearing as anything remarkable. It was simply the voice of the territory in winter. He had learned not to argue with it. He spotted the dark shape from 50 yards out and thought at first it was a deer that had gotten turned around and collapsed. It happened sometimes, animals exhausted and confused by the white featurelessness of a blizzard, lying down and simply not getting up again. He urged Drummer forward and the horse went reluctantly, ears pinned back, knowing before Cecil did that this was something unusual. She was lying on her side in the snow, one arm stretched out ahead of her as though she had been reaching for something just beyond her grasp when the cold finally pulled her under. She wore a long wool coat that had soaked through entirely, her dark hair plastered flat against her pale cheek, and she had no hat and no gloves. She could not have been more than 25 years old. Cecil swung down from Drummer before the horse had fully stopped and dropped to one knee beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck with a rancher's practiced urgency, and found a pulse so faint it was nearly a suggestion. "Lord Almighty," he breathed out. He did not stop to wonder how she had come to be there, or who she was, or what her name might be. He got his arms under her and lifted her, and she was heavier than she looked because her clothes were saturated, and he managed to get her draped across Drummer's withers before hauling himself back into the saddle behind her. He held her against him with one arm around her waist, and turned the horse south toward the ranch house at a pace that was faster than was wise in those drifts, but slower than he needed. The house was a solid, low-roof structure that Cecil had built with his own hands 7 years ago when he had come out from Missouri with $200 and an appetite for land that surprised even him. It had 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace big enough to walk into, and a kitchen that ran along the east wall. He had been a bachelor in it for all 7 of those years, and the house bore the particular quality of a man-kept space. Functional, clean enough, but empty in a way that went beyond furniture. He got her inside and laid her by the fire and began stripping the wet coat off her with the brisk efficiency of a man who had doctored frostbitten calves and brought premature colts into the world and was not squeamish about the needs of a body in crisis. He wrapped her in every quilt he owned and kept the fire roaring. He heated water and held a warm, damp cloth to her hands and her face. He talked to her without expecting an answer, the low murmur of his voice filling the room the way a man talks to a frightened animal to keep it anchored to the living world. "You stay here now," he said. "You stay right here with me." She did not respond for a very long time. He fed more wood into the fire. He sat beside her on the floor with his back against the hearthstone and watched the terrible bluish color in her lips slowly give way to something closer to pale. He noticed she was wearing calico under the coat, a traveling dress with small blue flowers on it, and sturdy boots that were good quality, better than a working woman would own. He noticed the ring on her right hand, not a wedding band but a signet ring with a flower pattern, and he noticed the faded bruise along her left jaw that the cold had not been able to hide entirely. He had questions. He kept them to himself and kept the fire burning. It was past midday when she stirred. He heard the change in her breathing first, something shifting from the shallow, unconscious rhythm to something with more intention behind it, and then her eyes came open. They were dark brown, nearly black, and she stared at the ceiling for a long moment before her gaze tracked sideways and found him sitting there on the floor beside her. She looked at him with those dark eyes full of something he could not immediately name, and then she opened her cracked lips and whispered something so quietly that he had to lean forward with his whole body. "Please," she breathed, "don't send me back." He sat very still for a moment. 3 words, whispered with such concentrated fear that they hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a stone thrown hard. He looked at the bruise along her jaw. He looked at the raw skin on her wrists where he had noticed faint marks when he was warming her hands, marks that could have been rope burns, could have been something else. He looked at her eyes, which were watching him with the total wariness of a person who has learned that help is rarely free. "I am not sending you anywhere," he said quietly. "Not until you are warm and fed and able to tell me your name." She held his gaze for another long moment as though measuring the weight of those words, deciding whether they could hold her. Then something in her face softened by the smallest possible degree and she closed her eyes again. "Inez," she said. "Inez Fletcher." He let out a slow breath. "Cecil Alden," he said. "This is my ranch. You are safe here, Miss Fletcher." She did not say anything else for a while. He got up and heated broth on the stove. A simple beef broth he had made 2 days ago from a soup bone. And when he brought it to her and helped her sit up enough to drink it, she wrapped both hands around the cup like it was the most precious thing she had ever held. Her hands were shaking badly. He steadied the cup with his own hand without comment. She drank the broth slowly, and he let her be quiet and warm, and he did not press her. Outside, the wind continued its long conversation with the prairie. Drummer had been put up in the barn by Cecil at some point during those frantic morning hours, and the other horses and the cattle were all where they ought to be. The ranch ran itself in the routine ways while inside the house. A woman named Inez Fletcher drank broth and slowly came back to life. It was evening before she spoke at length, and by then she was sitting up properly with the quilts around her shoulders and a little color in her cheeks, and Cecil was sitting across from her in his worn armchair with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands. He had not pushed her. She found her own way to it. "I was on the stage from Cheyenne," she said. Her voice was low and careful, like someone testing ice before crossing a frozen river. "Heading for Casper. There was a man on the stage who knew my husband, my former husband. We had been married 2 years and I left him in October after she paused. Her hand moved briefly to the faded bruise on her jaw, not quite touching it. After things became something I could not continue to endure, I took what belonged to me and I left. I had been staying with my cousin in Cheyenne since October, but he found out where I was, and she got word to me that he had sent 2 men looking for me. The stage was supposed to take me somewhere he did not know to look." Cecil said nothing. He waited. "One of the men on the stage recognized me," she said. "A friend of my husband's. I heard him telling the driver he needed to stop at the next way station because he had business. I knew what that meant. When the storm came and the stage had to slow, I got out." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought I could walk to the next homestead. I had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when I stopped being cold." "That is when it gets dangerous," Cecil said quietly, "when you stop feeling it." "I know that now," she said. She looked up at him. She had steady eyes, he noticed. Whatever fear she carried, it did not flicker in her gaze. She looked at things directly, the way a person does when they have decided that flinching costs more than it saves. "I appreciate your kindness," she said, with a formal quality to the words that told him she was not entirely sure yet what his kindness would cost her. "There's no cost to it," he said. "You are welcome to stay until you're well enough to decide where you want to go." She studied him for a moment. "You live alone." "I do." "Have you family nearby?" "My nearest neighbor is Tom Garrity, 11 miles east. He's got a wife, Ada, and 3 boys, decent people." He looked at his coffee mug. "If propriety is a concern, you could stay there once you are strong enough. Though Ada Garrity will talk your ear clean off and her boys will eat everything in the house." Something moved across Inez's face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "I am not particularly concerned with propriety at the moment," she said. "No," he agreed. "I expect not." He gave her his bedroom and slept on his own floor by the fire, and in the morning he made biscuits and eggs and fried salt pork, and she came out of the bedroom in her dried clothes looking steadier on her feet, though her color was still not right, and her hands still had the ghost of a tremor in them. She sat at his kitchen table and ate everything he put in front of her without apology, and he found this appealing in a way he could not have articulated. "I should like to write a letter," she said when she had finished, "to my cousin in Cheyenne to tell her I am alive. She will worry. I can ride it to town when the weather breaks," he said. "There is a post office in Ridgway, 12 miles south." She nodded. He produced paper and a pencil, and she sat at the table and wrote while he washed up the breakfast things. He tried not to notice the particular quality of her handwriting when he glanced over, the way it was neat and confident and ran straight across the page without lines to guide it. He mostly succeeded. The storm held for 3 more days. They were confined together in the house, and in those days Cecil learned things about Inez Fletcher the way a man learns a piece of land by walking it in different lights. He learned that she was from St. Louis originally, that she had come west at 21 when she married a cattle broker named Harlan Caro, who had seemed like prosperity and had turned out to be something else entirely. He learned that she had taught school for 2 years in St. Louis before the marriage, and that she read everything she could lay hands on. He had 3 books in the house: a Bible, a copy of Robinson Crusoe that had lost its cover, and an almanac, and she worked through all 3 of them before the storm broke. He learned that she had a laugh she kept on a short leash, letting it out only when she seemed to forget to hold it back, and that when it escaped it was genuine and warm and changed the quality of the room entirely. He learned that she watched him, not obviously, not with any agenda he could detect, but steadily, the way a cautious person learns a new environment. He supposed he could not blame her, and she learned things about him. She learned that he was 31 years old and had come to Wyoming with nothing, and built this ranch to its current 700 acres through work that was more or less continuous. She learned that he had a dry humor that came out sideways when he was comfortable, and that he was not comfortable often. She learned that he treated his horses with a tenderness he kept carefully hidden from his face. She had seen him in the barn through the window on the second day of the storm, working with Drummer, and the gentleness of his hands on that big roan horse told her something about Cecil Alden that all his careful, formal speech had not. On the 4th morning the sky was clear, and the temperature had risen, and Cecil saddled up to ride to Ridgway with her letter, and also to gather supplies. He told her she was welcome to rest and to help herself to anything in the kitchen, and she said she would be fine, and the particular independence in her voice when she said it told him that she meant it in a way that went deeper than the immediate circumstance. He was gone the better part of the day. Ridgway was a small town, population perhaps 300, with a main street of false-fronted buildings, a general store run by a German man named Hoffman, a saloon, a church that was also used as a school on weekdays, and a sheriff's office that was currently occupied by a man named Elias Duff, who was competent and honest, and had been both for 20 years. Cecil stopped at the sheriff's office because he was a practical man, and he thought Inez's situation was the kind that warranted a practical conversation. Elias Duff listened to Cecil's account with his hands flat on his desk and his pale eyes steady. He was in his late 50s, built like a fence post, with a white mustache that he periodically smoothed with 2 fingers when he was thinking. "Harlan Caro," Duff said, smoothing his mustache. "Cattle broker. Don't know the name personally, but I can send a wire to the sheriff in Cheyenne and see what he knows. A man sending men to retrieve his wife against her will is on the wrong side of the law, Cecil, whatever else he might claim. She is not a wife anymore, she says, or not in any practical sense. Was she legally divorced? I don't know, she didn't say." Duff nodded. "Well, you keep her safe and I will make some inquiries, If Caro's men come around, they've got no legal authority in this territory regardless. You've got every right to keep them off your land." Cecil rode home with this settled somewhat in his mind, along with 2 sacks of supplies from Hoffman's store, some salt, a good quantity of cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, a small length of fabric he had looked at for several minutes before purchasing because it was a deep blue-green that he thought matched the color of the morning sky over the mountains, and he had no real reason to buy it except that it made him think of Inez, and he was not ready to think too hard about what that meant. She had cleaned the house while he was gone. He came through the door and stopped, standing there in his coat and hat with snow on his boots, and looked at the room. It was the same room. But the ash had been cleared from around the hearth, and the floor had been swept, and his pile of harness leather in the corner had been organized and the table wiped down. It smelled of pine soap that she had apparently found under the kitchen counter. She was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at him with an expression that was caught partway between satisfaction and uncertainty, as if she was not sure whether she had overstepped. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I needed something to do." He looked around the room again. He had lived in this house alone for 7 years, and he had not noticed until right now what it had been missing. "I don't mind," he said. He put the supplies on the table and she moved around him, unpacking them with an easy competence that spoke of a woman who was not afraid of a kitchen, and he forgot about the fabric at the bottom of the bag until her hand found it and she drew it out and looked at it and then looked at him. He felt heat move up the back of his neck. "I thought you might want something to make use of," he said. "If you sew, I don't know if you sew." "I do sew," she said quietly. She was looking at the fabric with an expression he could not quite read. When she looked up at him, there was something in her eyes that was open in a way it had not been before. "It is a beautiful color." "It was on the shelf," he said. "Cecil." "Yes. Thank you." He was a man who had spent the better part of a decade not being thanked for much, living in a territory where a man's worth was measured in fence line and cattle count and the weather he had survived, and those 2 words hit him somewhere unexpected. He cleared his throat and told her he needed to see to the horses, and she told him supper would be ready when he was done, and he went out to the barn and stood in Drummer's stall for a minute with his forehead pressed against the horse's warm neck, thinking no particular thoughts, just breathing. Supper that night was a revelation. She had made corn bread from the meal he brought, and a stew from the dried beans, and some of the salt pork, and a quantity of dried herbs she had found in his kitchen that he had forgotten he owned. They sat across from each other at the table and ate, and the silence between them was different now, less like the silence of strangers, and more like the silence of 2 people who are beginning to find their way to each other through it. She told him about St. Louis, about the school where she had taught 30 children in a single room, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and how she had loved it with a completeness that she had not been able to articulate to Harlan Caro, who had thought it was a charming hobby for a young woman until they were married and he decided it was beneath her. She had given it up when he asked her to. She said this flatly, without self-pity, but her fork went still in her hand for a moment. "I should not have," she said. "But I thought love required accommodation. I accommodated myself right out of the thing I was best at." She looked up at him. "I will not make that mistake again." He looked at her across the table and he thought about a woman who had walked out into a Wyoming blizzard alone rather than go back to the life she had left, and he thought this woman was one of the bravest people he had ever met, and he also thought that she was telling him something important about who she intended to be going forward, and he felt something in his chest that he recognized as admiration and was beginning to suspect was something more. "You could teach here," he said. "In Ridgeway. The school uses the church building. I don't know if they have a teacher currently." She went still. She looked at him as though he had said something extraordinary when in fact he had only said the most obvious thing. "Do you think they would have a woman?" she asked. "Ada Garrity and 3 other women in town have been arguing with the church board about that very question for 2 years, he said. "I expect they would be glad of the ammunition." Something lit in Inez's face. It was brief and she pulled it back, but he had seen it. That light. He stored it away carefully. The weeks that followed were a careful, slow unfolding. Inez stayed at the ranch, and the arrangement was not something either of them had planned, but it settled into place with a naturalness that made plans seem unnecessary. She had nowhere else to go in the immediate term, and the truth was that Cecil found himself not minding this at all, which was a feeling he examined from several angles with the habitual wariness of a man who has been alone long enough to wonder if he has forgotten how to want company. She helped around the ranch in ways that were practical and unself-conscious. She cooked, and her cooking was good, genuinely good, the kind that made a man sit down to supper with something approaching eagerness rather than mere necessity. She mended things. She organized the kitchen with a systematic intelligence that made the space about 30% more functional. She did not try to follow him into the barn or the pastures, understanding without being told that a ranch has its rhythms and a man has his work, and the two should not be interfered with. But she was curious. She asked questions in the evenings, sitting across from him by the fire, about the land and the cattle and how the ranch worked, and her questions were good ones, the kind that showed she had been thinking, and he found himself explaining things he had never explained to anyone simply because no one had ever asked. The way the Hereford cattle handled the winters better than the Longhorns he'd started with. The way the North pasture was 3 degrees warmer because of the way the ridge broke the wind. The way water rights in Wyoming were a complicated, contentious thing that required both a lawyer and a strong back and occasionally the willingness to stand your ground with a neighbor. She listened to all of it. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered the answers. She was also healing, and the healing was not always graceful. There were nights when he heard her through the bedroom door, moving around, and he knew she was not sleeping. There was the morning she came to breakfast looking like she had been somewhere hard in the night, and he put coffee in front of her and did not remark on it, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and thanked him with her eyes. There were times when a sound or a word or some invisible thing would cause her to go inward abruptly, and he learned to give her the space of it without making a production of the giving. He was not a man who talked easily about interior things. He had been raised by a father who believed that a man's feelings were his own business, and that the business was best conducted quietly, and he had inherited this philosophy so thoroughly that it was more structural than chosen. But he found himself, with Inez, wanting to reach across the distance he had always maintained. He found himself choosing words more carefully, because she responded to words, because she heard things in them that other people didn't hear, because a conversation with her had a quality he had not experienced before and was having some difficulty naming. He named it eventually, on a Tuesday in late January when he was coming in from a long day of breaking ice from the watering troughs, and he came through the kitchen door and found her sitting at the table with Robinson Crusoe open and a square of the blue-green fabric in her lap that she was hemming into a skirt. And she looked up when he came in, and the simple, unguarded warmth in her expression stopped him in the doorway. He thought, "I do not want her to leave." He sat with this thought for several days before doing anything about it, examining it as rigorously as he examined a suspect piece of fence line, looking for weaknesses in its construction. He found that it held up. He found that it was not about convenience or habit or the mild pleasure of having someone to cook for him, though all of those things were present. It was about her specifically, about the way she thought and the way she laughed and the way she looked at things as though the world were worth understanding. About the steadiness in her and the bravery in her, and the way she had said, "Please don't send me back," in a whisper that contained a whole life's worth of damage and still held, underneath it, the shape of a woman who intended to survive. He was falling in love with her. He was a careful man, and he knew this was not a thing to rush. The letter from Elias Duff arrived in the first week of February, delivered by a boy from town who made the ride on a particularly clear morning. It contained what Duff had learned from his inquiries. Harlan Carroll was known to the Cheyenne sheriff as a man with a temper and some history of difficulty with the law, Nothing that had resulted in charges, but enough that people who knew him knew to be careful. The legal situation of the marriage was not straightforward, Duff wrote, because Inez had left the territory before filing any formal separation papers, and it was Duff's advice that she ought to see a lawyer about establishing her legal independence if she intended to remain in Wyoming. Inez read the letter twice with the kind of focused stillness she brought to difficult information. Then she looked up at Cecil. "He will not stop looking," she said. "Probably not," Cecil agreed. "He is a proud man." She said this not with fear but with a cold accuracy. "He won't accept that I left. Does he know where you are?" "No, my cousin wouldn't tell anyone," he nodded. "Then you have some time, and Duff is right, you should speak to a lawyer. There is one in Ridgeway, a man named Howard Briggs. He is adequate." She folded the letter neatly. "I will need money to pay him." Cecil thought about how to say the next thing. He was a man who chose his words carefully, and he chose these ones even more carefully than usual. "You could earn it," he said, "teaching. The church board meets on the second Thursday of the month. I know 3 of the 5 members, and I believe if you were willing to speak to them directly that they would hear you out." She looked at him with that direct, measuring gaze. "Are you trying to solve my problems for me, Cecil?" He met her eyes. "I am trying to give you tools to solve them yourself," he said. "There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," she said, "there is." And the way she said it had a warmth in it that made the room feel different. She went to the church board meeting on the second Thursday of February. Cecil drove her in the wagon, which was a practical necessity given the distance and weather, and had nothing to do with the fact that he wanted to see her face when she walked into a room with a purpose. She wore her calico dress with the blue flowers, and she had altered it with some of the blue-green fabric he'd bought, adding it as a panel at the hem and at the cuffs, a small flash of it that somehow made the whole ensemble look intentional and proud. She had pinned her dark hair up, and her posture was the kind that comes from a woman who has decided she will not be diminished. He waited in the wagon outside the church with the patience of a man who has spent a lot of his life waiting for things beyond his control to resolve themselves. An hour passed. He had brought his pipe, and he smoked it slowly and watched the last light go out of the sky over the western mountains. The mountains were tremendous, even from this distance, the kind of landscape that makes a man feel simultaneously small and privileged to be in the presence of something so much larger than himself. She came out of the church with Ada Garrity beside her, and even from the wagon he could see by the way she carried herself that it had gone well. Ada Garrity was a compact, energetic woman in her late 30s who was apparently physically incapable of walking without gesturing, and she was gesturing enthusiastically with both hands as they came down the church steps, which Cecil took as a good sign. Inez climbed up into the wagon seat beside him and pulled her coat closed and said, "They offered me the position. $18 a month, starting the 1st of March. He looked at her face. The light in it was the same light he had seen briefly when he first mentioned the idea, but now it was fully released, unguarded, brilliant. He felt something knock loose inside his chest. "Congratulations," he said, and meant it more than the word usually contained. She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one she forgot to hold back, and it broke open in the cold air of the Wyoming evening like something that had been waiting a long time to get out. On the way home she talked about what she was going to teach, and in what order and how she intended to organize the age groups, and he drove the wagon and listened and put in the occasional word, and thought that this was one of the best evenings he could remember in a long time. The stars came out in force, thick and brilliant the way they only are at altitude and far from any town's lantern light, and she fell quiet for a moment and looked up at them. "In St. Louis you couldn't see them like this," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did not expect Wyoming to be beautiful," she said. "I expected it to be hard." "It is both," he said. She turned and looked at him with the starlight on her face. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is both." He felt the weight of what was not said between them, the particular pressure of 2 people who have arrived at something together, and are not yet ready to name it. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins and said nothing, because the moment did not want words. It wanted exactly what it was. February moved through its cold middle weeks and edged toward its end. Inez started at the school on the 1st of March as promised, and Cecil took her into Ridgeway on those first mornings and came back in the evenings to collect her. And this became a rhythm that organized the days in a way that was pleasant to both of them without either of them acknowledging aloud that it was pleasant. She came home in the evenings with things to tell him. About the children, 23 of them ranging from 6 to 14, about their individual characters and challenges, and the ones who were quick and the ones who needed more time, and the one boy, a 9-year-old named Samuel Briggs, who was the lawyer's son, and who apparently had a mathematical gift that Inez described with the particular excitement of a teacher who has found a student worth stretching. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. He noticed that in these evening conversations she had stopped watching him quite so carefully, stopped measuring the weight of each exchange before committing to it. She was beginning, he thought, to trust him. This mattered to him more than he had expected. He saw Howard Briggs about the legal situation and came home with information that was both complicated and ultimately hopeful. Wyoming Territory had enacted a law in 1869 that gave women property rights and legal standing that did not exist in most eastern states, and though the matter of Inez's marriage status required some procedural work, Briggs was confident it could be resolved in her favor if Harlan Caro stayed east of the Nebraska border. The problem was that there was no guarantee he would. Cecil sat Inez down on a Sunday afternoon and laid all of this out for her plainly, because she was a woman who wanted information and not protection from it. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes steady. "He will come," she said when Cecil had finished. "I know him. He won't let it go. If he does, he has no legal authority here. Duff will back you up on that. Men like Harlan don't always concern themselves with authority," she said. This was true, and they both knew it, and Cecil let the truth of it sit in the room without trying to argue it away. "If he comes to the ranch," he said carefully, "I would like to handle it." She looked at him. "Cecil, I'm not saying you cannot handle your own affairs," he said quickly, because he had learned to read the particular tension in her voice that preceded her independence reasserting itself. "I am saying that you should not have to face him alone, and I would like to be there, if you will allow it." The tension eased. She looked at him for a long moment with something soft and careful moving through her expression. "I will allow it," she said. He went to bed that night and lay on his side looking at the dark ceiling and thought about Harlan Caro, and thought about the bruise on Inez's jaw that first day, and thought about the word allow, the particular quality of it when she said it, the decision in it. She had given him something with that word. He was not going to misuse it. The snow began to ease in March, which in Wyoming is not the same as spring, only a slightly different kind of cold. But the days lengthened and the light changed quality, and some mornings a person could stand in the yard and feel the sun on their face and believe, for a few minutes, in the possibility of warmth. On one such morning in mid-March, Inez came out of the house while Cecil was working at the fence along the south paddock and stood in the yard with her face tilted up to the light, her eyes closed. He looked at her from the fence line and looked away and looked back again. He set down his tools and walked over to her. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She did not open her eyes. "I am happy," she said, quietly and with a kind of wonder in it, as though she were reporting an unexpected discovery. "I did not know if I would be able to say that again." He stood beside her in the sunlight and the quiet and said, "I am glad." She opened her eyes and looked at him. They were standing very close, closer than they usually stood, and he was aware of this in a way that made it difficult to think about anything else. Her eyes searched his face. "Cecil," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you found me in the snow," she paused, "you brought me home and you took care of me, and you have done nothing but treat me with decency since then. and I would like to know whether that is simply the kind of man you are, or whether it is something particular." He held her gaze. He was a man who had spent 31 years being economical with his words, and he recognized this moment as one that required the opposite. "It began as the kind of man I am," he said, "and then it became particular." She was very still. The March wind moved around them, gentler than it had been for months. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I did not come here intending to need anyone. I spent 2 years of my life needing someone and learning what the cost of that could be, and I have been very deliberate about not putting myself back in a position of Inez. Of dependence, which I understand that what I am describing might sound like Inez." She stopped. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be dependent on me. I am not sure I even know how to ask for that, having lived this long alone. I am telling you that I find you remarkable and that I would like to be in your company for as long as you will permit it, and I would like to do that with you knowing that it is true." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was warm on them both. "All right," she said at last. "All right," he agreed. They stood there in the sunshine for another moment, and then she said she should go in and prepare her lesson notes for the next day's school, and he said he needed to finish the fence, and they separated with a kind of gravitational difficulty, as though the air between them had thickened into something with pull. He went back to his fence and hit his thumb with the hammer almost immediately and stood there with his hand clenched and his face perfectly still, because a man who has just told a woman she is remarkable does not bellow about a smashed thumb. The following weeks had the quality of something building, the way a storm builds, visibly, and yet still somehow surprising when it arrives. They talked more openly. He told her about his family in Missouri, about his father who had died when Cecil was 19 and left him nothing but the sense that he needed to make his own way, and about his mother who still lived in Joplin and wrote him twice a year with letters full of practical advice and gentle reproach. He told her about the winter of 1880 when he had lost 40 head of cattle in a blizzard and had stood at the window of this house looking out at the white landscape and wondered if he had made a fundamental error in coming here, and how in the spring the range had come back green and the remaining cattle had thrived, and the sense of having survived something had made the land feel like his more completely than it had before. She told him about the things she had not yet told him, about the early months of her marriage when Harlan Caro had been charming and the marriage had seemed to be what she had hoped it would be, and about how it had changed, gradually and then all at once, the way a rope frays before it breaks. She told him about the night in September, 2 months before she left, when she had understood fully that she was in danger, and about the 4 weeks she spent planning her departure with the careful, quiet intelligence of a woman who knows she will get only one chance at it. Cecil listened to all of this with a stillness in him that was not absence but presence, the full attention of a man who understands that a woman telling him these things is not asking for his anger on her behalf, but for his witness. He gave her his witness without flinching. "You are not afraid of my history," she said one evening. It was not a question. "No," he said, "most men would be. Most men would find it complicated." He looked at her steadily. "A man who finds a woman's survival complicated is a fool," he said. She looked at him for a long moment and he watched something change in her face, something final giving way, some last held-back piece of caution letting go. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat like that by the fire for a time that he would not afterward be able to measure. The trouble came in April, which was not a surprise, only an arrival that had been expected long enough that, when it happened, the first feeling was almost relief. Cecil was in the barn early on a Thursday morning when he heard a horse on the road and looked out to see 2 riders coming up the track to the house. They were not men he knew. They rode with a purpose that was not casual, and one of them was big in the way that some men are big specifically for the purpose of making other men reconsider their positions. Cecil set down the harness he was working on and walked out of the barn. Inez had not left for school yet. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses and came to the door and stopped. And Cecil saw her face and knew from it that she recognized at least one of these men. He walked to the house and stood on the porch beside her, not in front of her. The two men pulled up at the yard. The bigger one had a red beard and cold eyes, and the smaller one was younger with a narrow face and the look of someone who has spent considerable time being menacing on behalf of someone else. "We're looking for a woman named Inez Fletcher," the big one said. "No one by that name here," Cecil said. "Her husband says different." "Her husband is not in a position to know what names people use on my land," Cecil said. His voice was perfectly level. "This is private property. You have not been invited." The big man looked at Inez standing beside Cecil. "Mrs. Carroll," he said, "your husband wants you home." Inez's hand had found Cecil's arm at some point, and she held it without gripping, the contact steady. She stepped forward by about 6 inches. "I am not Mrs. Carroll," she said, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "My name is Inez Fletcher, which was my name before I was obligated to change it, and Sheriff Duff in Ridgeway has been made aware of your presence in this territory. If you think Harlan Carrow's wanting is sufficient legal authority to drag a person anywhere, I suggest you consult a copy of Wyoming territorial law before you make any further embarrassing decisions." There was a pause. The big man looked at Cecil. Cecil said quietly and without theater, "I will give you the count of 5 to turn those horses around." Something in Cecil's manner, the complete lack of heat in it, the way it was stated rather than threatened, the way his hand sat at his side without reaching for anything, but with the particular stillness that suggested the reaching was available if required, communicated something that evidently the big man could read. He looked at Inez again. He looked at Cecil. He smoothed his beard with one hand. "You tell Harlan Carroll," Inez said, clear and unhurried, "that I will be seeing a judge in Cheyenne as soon as the roads permit, and that the outcome of that meeting will be final, and that if either of you or anyone else he sends comes to this property again, the sheriff will be waiting." The men exchanged a look. The smaller one said nothing throughout. The big man wheeled his horse and they rode back down the track the way they had come, and Cecil watched them until they were out of sight, and then he stood there another moment listening to the sound of them disappear. He turned to Inez. She was standing very still with her arms folded against her chest, and the color in her face was not quite right. He stepped close to her and she let him, and he put his hands on her arms, just holding her steady, and she pressed her eyes closed briefly. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. She let out a long breath. "I was terrified." "I know, you were still magnificent." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and they were standing very close in the April morning, and he could see the fine details of her face, the small scar at her left temple that he had never asked about, the way her lashes were thick and dark, the particular quality of her eyes when she was looking at him like this, which was direct and open and held something he now recognized with certainty. He kissed her. He did it slowly and without any particular performance, simply leaning in and meeting her mouth with his, and she made a small sound against him that was not surprise but recognition, as though they had been moving toward exactly this point for the entire length of their acquaintance, and she was simply glad to have arrived. They stood there on the porch in the April sunlight for a long moment, and when he drew back she was looking at him with that look, the one that changed the quality of the room, or in this case the quality of the yard and the sky and the distant mountains and everything in his field of vision. "I am going to be late for school," she said. He hitched up the wagon. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically different, not changed in the large mechanical ways. The ranch work continued and the school continued, and the dinners and the evenings and the rhythms of the days persisted in their patterns. But the texture of everything was different. The way daylight on a landscape is different from the same landscape in shade. They touched more easily. He found reasons to be close to her. She brought her hand to his arm when she passed him in the kitchen as naturally as breathing. The evenings by the fire acquired a weight and a warmth that made the room feel smaller in the best possible way. They talked, still. Long conversations that ran past sensible bedtimes. She told him things and he told her things, and what they were really doing was giving each other a language for what was between them, building it carefully, and with intention the way a man builds a thing he wants to last. In May, Howard Briggs wrote to inform Inez that her trip to Cheyenne could be arranged, and that he was confident the judge would find in her favor given the evidence of Harlan Caro's conduct and the provisions of territorial law. The stage south ran twice a week and the spring roads were passable. Cecil rode with her. He had not been back to Cheyenne since his first year in Wyoming, and he had forgotten how it felt, the different scale of it, the noise and the crowd, and the smell of a real city after months on open range. Inez navigated it with a focused efficiency that he admired, moving through the business of lawyers and courts and legal proceedings with the same intelligence she brought to everything else. The judge, a heavy-set man named Garrett who had seen a considerable range of human circumstance cross his courtroom, granted the formal dissolution of the marriage without drama. They celebrated by having supper in a proper restaurant, which was a thing Cecil had not done in years, and which he found enjoyable primarily because Inez ordered everything on the menu she found interesting and told him about each dish as though narrating an expedition. She was lighter that evening than he had ever seen her. The thing she had been carrying was not gone. He knew it did not simply disappear, but it had been set down somewhere official, and the weight of it was different. Walking back to the hotel through the Cheyenne evening with the lanterns lit along the street and the warm May air moving over them, she put her arm through his, and he covered her hand with his, and they walked like that through the city. And he thought about what his life had been before January, and what it was becoming, and felt something he was going to have to call by its name eventually. On the way back to the ranch, in the stage, sitting beside her with her head leaning on his shoulder because the roads were rough and she was tired, and it was the most natural arrangement. He thought about how to say the thing he had been composing for several weeks. He said it that evening back at the ranch, sitting on the porch in the warm May twilight watching the colors move across the sky over the mountains. He had poured her coffee and there were 2 rocking chairs that he had brought out from the barn where they had been stored unused for 7 years and now seemed indispensable. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Ask." "I would like you to stay," he said, "permanently, as my wife if you will have me." She was quiet for a moment. The sky did its slow work overhead. "Cecil," she said. "I know it is soon," he said, "by some measures. By others it feels as though we have been arriving at this particular question for months." She set her coffee cup down on the arm of the chair. She looked at the mountains and then she looked at him. "I told you in February that I would not make myself dependent," she said. "I remember. I want to be clear that that is still true. I would keep teaching. I would keep my own money and my own opinions and, Inez," he said, "I would not have you any other way." She searched his face. He let her search because it was his face and everything she was looking for was there. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. They sat on the porch together while the sun went down behind the mountains, and the stars began their appearance above the dark peaks, one by one, and the Wyoming night came in around them both, vast and cold, and full of the kind of silence that is not empty but complete. They were married on a Saturday in June at the Ridgeway Church, which was small enough that the congregation spilled out the door and onto the steps. Ada Garrity wept throughout and organized everything else simultaneously, which was characteristic. Tom Garrity stood up with Cecil and was visibly moved, which surprised people who knew him. Inez's cousin Rachel had made the journey from Cheyenne and stood with her, a small round woman with lively eyes who was clearly delighted with everything about the situation, and told Cecil 3 times that he had better be worthy of her cousin, and Cecil told her each time that he would endeavor to be. Elias Duff attended in his good coat and shook Cecil's hand with both hands and told him he had done well. The children from Inez's school were there, 23 of them in various degrees of formality, and Samuel Briggs, the mathematical prodigy, sat in the front row and looked gravely at the proceedings with the air of someone taking professional notes. Inez wore a dress she had made from the blue-green fabric, and from additional white muslin that Ada Garrity had provided with tremendous enthusiasm, and she walked into the church on her own and stood up at the front with complete composure. And when Cecil looked at her across the short distance of the altar, he felt a certainty that he recognized as the complete absence of doubt. The preacher said the words, and they said their words back, and Cecil put a ring on her finger, a ring he had ordered from the jeweler in Cheyenne, a simple silver band with a small garnet in it, because he had noticed she liked the color red in small quantities. When he put it on her hand, she looked at it and then looked at him, and the look she gave him was the full, unguarded thing, the light he had been trying not to stare at since February, and now he had no reason not to. The summer that followed was the best one Cecil could remember. The ranch work was good that year. The spring rains had been sufficient. The cattle were healthy, and he had hired a young hand named Pedro Vasquez, who was 17 and capable, and who had ridden up from New Mexico looking for work with a battered saddle and a cheerful disposition, and whose presence freed Cecil from some of the more time-consuming solitary labor. Pedro turned out to have a gift with the horses that rivaled Cecil's own, and they worked well together with the comfortable efficiency of two people who do not need to talk much to understand each other. Inez taught through the summer, the school running a shorter session but running, because she had convinced the church board that children who did not read over the summer forgot things, and she was right and they were persuaded. She came home in the afternoons and worked in the kitchen garden she had started at the east side of the house, which was producing with more ambition than either of them had anticipated, tomatoes and beans and squash and a quantity of herbs that made the kitchen smell excellent. She sat on the porch in the evenings. She read. She talked to Cecil about the children, and Cecil talked to her about the land, and Pedro told them both elaborate stories about New Mexico that they were approximately 80% certain were invented, but were very entertaining. In late August, Inez told Cecil she was expecting. She told him at the breakfast table on a weekday morning, directly and without preamble, which was consistent with who she was. She watched his face. He sat very still for a moment. He thought about the house that had been empty for 7 years. He thought about the man he had been in January, riding out in the dark to check a fence line, alone in the way that had stopped feeling like anything other than normal. He thought about all of it, and then he thought about the future, about the shape of it, and it was good. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was the first question. "I am very well," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the unguarded light in her face. "Good," he said. He kissed her hands. He pressed them to his face for a moment with his eyes closed. She put her free hand on his hair. "Cecil," she said softly. "I know," he said. The autumn was golden, the particular gold that the Wyoming country does in October, the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow, and the light on the grass becoming amber, and the mountains turning blue at the base and white at the top with early snow. Inez got larger and more herself simultaneously, which was something Cecil had not anticipated but found entirely logical once he observed it. She was less afraid than she had been in January, less watchful, more willing to be in a moment without scanning its edges. She still had the steady eyes. She would always have those, but the wariness behind them had softened into something more like ordinary caution, the reasonable vigilance of a person who has learned that the world requires attention. She kept teaching until December, when the distances and the cold made the journey impractical, and she had arranged with the church board to return in the spring. The students made her a card before the last day of school that was decorated with what appeared to be a highly interpretive portrait of her and Cecil, which Cecil was shown, and which caused him to examine the artwork for a long time in silence before saying that it was extremely accurate. The baby came in February. They had talked about what would happen when the time came, and the plan was to bring Ada Garrity, and if necessary the doctor from Ridgeway, who was a competent man named Dr. Holt. What happened was that the snow came early and heavy on the evening of the 14th, and by the time anyone realized labor had begun in earnest, the road to Ridgeway was not passable. Ada Garrity had ridden over 2 days earlier to be nearby, and so she was there, and Cecil was there, and Pedro was sent to the barn with firm instructions to remain there and stay busy and not come in until told. Cecil stayed. Inez had not asked him to, and he had not made a production of it. He simply stayed. He held her hand when she wanted it and moved away when she didn't, and kept the fire roaring and boiled water when Ada told him to, and did not at any point during a long and effortful night make himself the center of events, which was a considerable exercise of restraint in the circumstances, because the sounds of Inez in pain did things to his chest that he was going to need a considerable period of time to think about. At dawn, in the early gray light of a February morning that he would recognize as an anniversary as long as he lived, their son was born. He was red-faced and emphatic about his arrival, announcing himself with a volume that Pedro heard from the barn, and Cecil held him for the first time wrapped in flannel with the fire warm behind him, and the snow falling outside the window, and Inez watching from the bed, with the particular exhausted brightness of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and knows it. "Well," Cecil said, looking down at this small and indignant person in his arms. He found he did not have words beyond that, which was an unusual position for a man who had been carefully choosing his words for 32 years. "Well," Inez agreed and smiled at him, and it was the best and most complete smile he had ever seen on any human face. They named him James Alden, James after Inez's father, who had been dead 15 years but whose name she had carried in her heart all that time, and Alden for the obvious reason. James was a child who entered the world with firm opinions and expressed them clearly, which everyone who knew his mother found entirely predictable. He was healthy and loud and interested in everything, and Cecil discovered in himself a capacity for tenderness that he had not known was there, the way you discover water on land you thought was dry. He sat with the baby in the evenings when Inez was tired, rocking in the chair by the fire, and the boy would look up at him with dark eyes that were his mother's exactly, and Cecil would look back and feel the improbable specific weight of a life that had become, against all odds and without any particular plan, the life he would have chosen if choosing had been available to him. Pedro, upon meeting James for the first time, looked at him with the gravity of a man in the presence of history, and announced that he was a very serious baby, which Ada Garrity disputed loudly, which caused James to add his own voice to the dispute with great enthusiasm. Spring came, and then another summer, and the ranch grew. Cecil used the good cattle income of the previous year to buy an additional 200 acres to the north, the land he had been watching for 3 years. Inez returned to the school in March, and James came with her for the first few weeks, installed in a basket behind her desk, observed by 23 students with the focused scientific curiosity of young people examining an interesting specimen. Samuel Briggs spent considerable time teaching James to count, with mixed results, though James seemed to enjoy the company. The letter from Harlan Carew arrived in April of the second year, a letter addressed to Inez Care of the Ridgeway Post Office, and she brought it home and sat at the table and opened it with a steadiness that Cecil watched from across the room. She read it twice and then set it down. "He has remarried," she said. Cecil waited. "A woman in Denver." Inez looked at the letter. Her expression was composed and thoughtful. "He is informing me of this. I think he means it to sting." She folded the letter carefully. "It does not sting." "No, no," she looked up at him with clear eyes. "I feel something, but it is not pain. It is more like," she thought for a moment, "relief." "That he has found somewhere else to put his attention." Cecil nodded. "Good," he said simply. She looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with James on his hip, James being in a period of life where he required near-constant holding to satisfy what appeared to be a fundamental need to observe events from a height, and Cecil holding him was completely natural and completely characteristic, and Inez looked at the two of them together in the kitchen doorway, and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unsettled since the letter arrived. "I am finished with him," she said. Not with anger, not with triumph, simply as a statement of completed business. "Yes," Cecil said, "you are." She got up and came to where he stood and put her hand on his chest and leaned up and kissed him, and James, caught between them, grabbed a handful of each of their clothing and held on, which seemed to please him considerably. The years built on each other in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because the territory was not without difficulty, and the work of a ranch is never truly finished, and the world does not stop being complicated because two people have found each other. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the difficulty of range boundaries with a neighbor to the southwest who was less scrupulous than Tom Garrity. There were illnesses in the livestock that cost them badly one year, and the anxiety of a drought that threatened the creek water in another. There was the grief of losing one of the old horses, not Drummer, but one of the mares, a gentle gray named Lucinda that Inez had become particularly attached to, and the way Inez cried about it quietly in the evening while Cecil sat beside her without trying to fix the unfixable. And there were the good things. The way the ranch became more itself each year, the buildings solid and the fences tight and the land producing and the cattle healthy. The way Pedro Vasquez became in all but name a member of the household, eventually bringing his own life to it. A young woman named Elena from Casper whom he married in 1888 and who turned out to be a force of considerable practical competence, who took the ranch vegetable garden from ambitious to extraordinary. The way James grew from the emphatic infant into a boy who was his mother's son in his sharpness and his father's in his steadiness, a combination that was alarming in a 12-year-old and would presumably be formidable in a man. Inez continued to teach. She taught the Ridgeway School for 6 years, and in that time made herself essential to the community in the way that good teachers do, becoming the kind of person that the town could not quite imagine having not had. She argued for and eventually won a second classroom, which allowed the older students to be taught separately and with more rigor, and she trained 2 successive assistant teachers in the years after, young women from the territory whose education she took seriously and whose careers she followed with proprietary pride. She also started a small lending library. This began as 3 boxes of books that she had accumulated from her own purchases, and from donations solicited with a persistence that the town's inhabitants found both admirable and slightly exhausting, and it grew over time into a dedicated shelf at the back of the schoolroom, and eventually into a separate room at the church that was open on Saturday afternoons. Cecil built the shelves for it one weekend in 1887 and installed them while Inez organized the books, and they worked in the dusty, pleasant space of it, handing things back and forth and arguing amiably about the organizational system. And it was one of the many afternoons of ordinary happiness that he collected and kept without ceremony. In the spring of 1889, Inez told him at the breakfast table that James was going to have a brother or sister. She said it the same way she had told him the first time, directly and without preamble, and he got up and came around to her side of the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands, same as before. She looked at him with the same light. "I know," he said. Their daughter arrived in November, just ahead of the first real snowfall. A girl with Cecil's gray eyes and dark hair that was clearly all Inez, and they named her Nora Margaret. Nora because Inez had loved the name for years and never had a reason to use it, and Margaret after Cecil's mother in Joplin, who wept when she received the letter and who wrote back a reply that was 5 pages long and contained more warm feeling than she had expressed to Cecil in the combined total of all her previous letters. James was 8, and regarded Nora with the air of a person who has been told a new responsibility is arriving and has decided to take this seriously. He was protective of her from the first day in a way that was touching and occasionally excessive. Cecil watched his son with his daughter and thought about the years ahead of them, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who knows that what he has is worth keeping. The winter of 1889 was the year Wyoming applied for statehood, and the territory was full of debate and energy about what this would mean and how it would be organized. In 1890, Wyoming entered the Union as the 44th state, and it was notable for something that had been true since 1869 and was now encoded in the state constitution. Women had the vote. Women had had the vote in Wyoming territory since before Cecil arrived, which in the context of the rest of the nation was extraordinary, and Inez had exercised it as a matter of solemn routine since her arrival. When statehood made it official, and the newspapers back east made a great noise about the novelty of it, she read the coverage with an expression that was partly amusement, and partly the particular patience of a person watching others discover what they themselves have known for some time. On the evening of statehood, she sat on the porch with Cecil in the summer warmth, and he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, which he kept for occasions, and handed her one. She took it and they raised the glasses without particular ceremony. "To Wyoming," she said. "To Wyoming," he agreed. She sipped the whiskey and watched the mountains go purple in the evening light. James was inside with a geography book he had been studying with fierce concentration for 2 weeks. Nora was asleep, 11 months old and already showing a character that was going to be something to contend with, a child who looked at the world with a focused assessment that made Cecil think of the way Inez had looked at him in those first weeks, measuring the weight of things. "Cecil," Inez said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. 7 years had changed him in the ways that the West changes a man, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular quality of a man who has been outdoors most of his life, the gray that was beginning in his hair at the temples. She studied him with the direct gaze she had always used on him, the one that had stopped being cautious a long time ago and was now something else, something that had his name on it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I was in that snow," she said. "When I had stopped feeling the cold and I had lain down, I thought very clearly that I was going to die. I was not afraid. She paused. I was sorrowful. About all the things that would not happen. I had this very clear thought that I had not yet found my life, that I had been living something else, something I had been given rather than chosen, and that dying in the snow was," she looked at the mountains, "deeply unfair." He was very still, listening. "And then I did not die," she said. "Because you came," she looked at him. "And every day since then has been the life I would have chosen. The teaching and this place and our children and you," she held his gaze. "I have been meaning to say this clearly for a long time. I have never said it clearly." He looked back at her across the porch in the Wyoming evening. He thought about the morning he had found her, the dark shape in the white snow, the thin pulse under his fingers, the whisper of "please don't send me back." Those 3 words that had broken him open in a way that had not closed and was not going to. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I am not thanking you," she said. "I am telling you that I love you, with full knowledge of what that means and of what it costs and of what I am worth and what you are worth, and with nothing held back." She said it with the steadiness of a woman who has learned the exact value of truth. "I wanted to say it that plainly." He reached across and took her hand. He held it in both of his and looked at it, the silver ring with the garnet, the strong, capable hand that had held a coffee cup in his house while she trembled with cold on the first morning, the same hand that had graded 230 school papers and planted 3 dozen tomato seedlings and held their son on his first night and their daughter on hers. "I know," he said. "I have known. And I love you the same way." He looked at her, with nothing held back. She smiled at him. The full smile, the one that had been breaking out of her since February of 1884 in increments, and was now fully at home on her face. Inside the house, James called out that he had found Wyoming on the map. announcing it with the triumph of a boy who has done a thing he has been working hard at. And Nora woke from her sleep and added her own voice to the evening in her authoritative way. And the sound of the children came out through the open door and into the summer air around them. And Cecil kept hold of his wife's hand, and they sat together on the porch, with the Wyoming stars coming out above them, and the mountains dark and enormous to the west, and the land stretching out in all directions around the house he had built with his own hands, the house that was no longer empty, the house that held everything he had not known he was building toward. The next morning came as Wyoming mornings did, in light that was thin and brilliant, and came over the eastern plains like something poured, gold and clear and wide. Cecil was up before dawn the way he always was, moving through the kitchen in the dark to set the coffee on, stepping out to the porch to feel the morning before it was fully formed. Drummer was long gone. 18 was old for a horse, and the big roan had lived a good long life. But there was a new gelding in the paddock, a young bay named Ridley that Pedro had helped him choose, and the horse stood at the fence in the early light and watched Cecil on the porch with ears forward and an alert benevolence. Cecil leaned on the porch rail and looked at his land. 900 acres now, a full section nearly, and the cattle healthy on it. The house at the center of everything, solid and lasting, with the barn and the outbuildings arranged around it, and the kitchen garden along the east side, and the lending library books stacked behind the church in Ridgeway, and Inez's voice in the school 5 days a week teaching 28 children that the world was knowable and worth knowing. He heard the kitchen door open behind him and her step on the boards and the small familiar weight of her hand on his back, between his shoulders, warm through his shirt. "The coffee," he said. "Is ready," she said. "I made it." She came to stand beside him and looked at the morning with him, both hands wrapped around her mug, her shoulder touching his arm. In the paddock, Ridley tossed his head at the new light. "James wants to learn to ride properly," she said. "Not just to sit a horse, properly." "He's ready," Cecil said. "He is absolutely convinced of that. He's right this time." She smiled into her mug. "Pedro says he has a good seat already." "He does. He's got your balance." She turned and looked at him with an amused expression. "I do not have a particularly notable balance. You have held steady through things that would have knocked most people flat," he said simply. "I have always considered that a kind of balance." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was full on them both, and inside the house the children would be waking soon, James first because he was always first, a child who treated sleep as an imposition, and Nora somewhat after in her own determined time. Pedro and Elena were in their small house at the north end of the property and would be starting their own morning, and the ranch would come alive around them the way it did every morning, with the particular collective animation of a living thing. Inez put her hand up and touched Cecil's jaw, her palm against the rough morning stubble of it, and he turned his head slightly into her hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He covered her hand with his own. He thought about how to say it, this man who had always been economical with words, and found that for once the right words were simple and did not need to be chosen carefully because they were only true. "I am thinking that I am happy," he said, "in the way that lasts." She looked at him with her dark eyes, clear and steady in his, and outside the Wyoming morning spread itself across the land in all directions, enormous and brilliant and full of the particular light that falls on a country that has been survived and settled and made into something worth staying for. "Yes," she said, "in the way that lasts." James appeared in the kitchen doorway in his long underwear, announcing at volume that he was hungry and that Ridley was looking at him from the paddock, and that he would like to begin riding lessons today if possible. And Nora could be heard from the bedroom taking up her morning position on the subject of being awake, and the house gathered itself around them all, warm and solid and built to hold. Cecil dropped a kiss onto the top of Inez's head and went inside to make the biscuits, and she stood a moment longer on the porch with her coffee and the morning, the mountains to the west still holding the last of the night's blue, the east blazing with the new sun, and the feeling in her chest was the full and settled weight of a life that was hers. She had walked out of a storm and found this. She had whispered, "Please don't send me back into the cold dark of a January morning," and a man with careful hands and a roan horse had brought her in from the snow and given her warmth and time and the particular dignity of being seen without being diminished. She had stayed. She had built. She was home. She went inside and the door swung closed behind her, and the morning continued its work across the Wyoming land, and the house stood in it, full of light and the sound of people who belonged to each other and would continue to stand.